Hello, welcome to our RegoUniversity webinar series. Today we're looking at financial management in CA PPM, or Clarity. I'm Camille Pack, Director of Marketing. Thanks for joining us. So before we start, I'd like to take a moment to point out some of the features on your console. You can resize any of those visible boxes. Most interesting is the resource list box. We've got a link there to our free training classes, which includes our new road mapping class for using the modern UX. We also have a link to our financial management white paper that goes with today's presentation, and RegoUniversity, which is the largest Clarity and Agile training and networking event of 2019. That's September 29th in San Diego. If you'd like to schedule a meeting with a Rego consultant, just click the Contact Rego button and submit your information. So let's get started. Today we've got Wes McCubry and Sarah Garvey with us. Wes is a solution architect with 12 years in the PPM space. He's led PMOs, and he loves to help establish tools and governance teams filled with great people. And Sarah leads our change management training programs, and she's fantastic. You've probably heard both of them on lots of webinars. So Wes, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Great. Thanks, Camille. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate everybody taking, I guess, if you're here with me on the East Coast, your lunch break, walking through financial management. And if you are with Sarah out on the West Coast, your morning coffee. Appreciate the time. We know it's an hour is tough to squeeze out of a busy schedule. We're anxious to make it worthwhile for you. What we're going to cover today is a complement to a white paper that we released just a few weeks back in and around financial management in Clarity. The white paper itself takes a best practice view on the deployment. We're going to focus a little bit more on the tactical pieces, trying to answer the questions why, what, and how, with a particular focus on the what. So while there's a little bit of overlap in this webinar on the why and the how, I think where you're going to get more value out of the webinar versus the white paper is on the what. So we're going to look to address them all and hopefully have a little bit of fun with this. Financial management, I mean, I can't think of a more exciting topic to talk about it to start your day or as a part of your lunch hour. And I've got a great partner to help me do that, hopefully to add a bit of levity and excitement to the topic. So with me is Sarah. Sarah, you want to say hi to everybody?
Yep. Hey, just want to let everybody know I'll be here answering questions. So as Wes is talking, as we're both talking, if you've got questions, pop them into the Q&A box, and I'll try to answer them, and then we'll call some out, and Wes can answer to the group as well. If you've got any issues, sounds like there might be some audio issues and stuff, just keep popping those in there and we'll get to them. And we're excited to talk through this today. And like Wes said, I think what we really want to focus on is not necessarily that best practice, perfect world, how to do this, but really tactically, for your organization, maybe you're very early on, or maybe you're, just not quite ready for the full-blown financials. How can you make the step to just kind of get there slowly?
Great. Yeah, agreed, Sarah. And I think if anybody who's attended any of my webinars in the past, I try to keep this as conversational as possible. Sarah and I will just kind of banter off of each other on particular topics. I'm not one to drone over PowerPoint reading slide by slide. So I'll try to, again, try to keep this as informal as I can. I think these are best delivered using that format. So hand in hand with that goes the Q&A, as Sarah mentioned. Fire those in. We'll try to address them as we go along, and we'll also try to leave some time at the end to respond more specifically to those questions as they come in. So like I said, we're going to focus on that what. Try to highlight really the initial investment that you need to make into financials and Clarity, and at the end, by way of a demonstration, show you or give you a little taste of hopefully that payout. So we're actually going to hop into one of our environments towards the end of this session and walk through some of the concepts that we've talked about today, hopefully make it a little bit more real. In terms of format for this, we debated a couple of different layouts. I talked about at one point, debated running this as kind of like an investment seminar. Again, we're trying to have a little bit of fun with it. where we give you a series of stock tips, which equate to configurations in Clarity, and then we talk about the payoffs of each at the end. The more I think I debated that and realized, looking at my past investment strategies, I think that could end up in a pretty bad place. My stock tips aren't necessarily the ones that you should really follow up on. The rotary phone stock is not doing as well as I should hope. So with that, we'll kind of dive right into it, and I am going to go slide by slide. The jokes, by the way, are not going to get any better. I can actually hear everybody's eyes rolling as I drop these jokes from time to time. So feel free in the Q&A to drop a little LOL. That'll make me feel better. Sarah gives me a courtesy laugh every now and then. That's about as good as I get. So we're going to hop right into it and start with a little bit of a question Q&A for you guys. It helps us cater some of the conversation if we understand where you are with your implementation of financials. We've tried to organize this into 4 categories. Take a few seconds, populate this with kind of where you are in your journey. Are you just doing some discovery at this point, just learning about Clarity Financials? Are you actively planning to introduce it or need some tactical next steps? Have you just deployed it, or have you been using financials for some time now? So we'll take a few seconds to let folks chime in on that. We cue the Jeopardy music. By the way, I learned this the other day, total tangent. The Jeopardy theme song earned about $80 million in royalties. Merv Griffin wrote it. How about that, huh? You got a ditty you could think of, Sarah, that'll earn us $80 million?
No, but we should start working on it.
Yeah, I think Camille can just hum something in the back. We'll start charging folks every time we hear it 10 cents. So it looks like the results are in. Most folks here doing a bit of discovery, so a great time to hop into a webinar like this. We're going to give you all the details I think you need. Folks who have been using it for a few months is a close second. Actually, it's now taking the lead. So hopefully some of this can help you maybe even make some course corrections, simplify some things, or revisit some decisions that you may have made in the past, and just make sure or perhaps confirm where you guys are heading. Okay, great. So that's good background for Sarah and I as we hop into the first slide here. So I mentioned those 3 major questions: the what, the why, and the how. We'll start with the why, and if you've worked with Rego, you know that we focus on the why right up front, really with any type of implementation, not just financials. But it's particularly important when we talk about financials. Because it is going to require some work on the side of the project manager. We're going to ask them to manage forecasts, and we're going to ask them to work with portfolio managers and financial managers to establish budgets. So there's some work involved. So we have to make sure that you have a value proposition that's clearly defined and well articulated. And this slide talks to, from my opinion, the 4 major reasons you would want to introduce financials within your Clarity implementation. The first is that it's very difficult to measure the progress or the health of a project without the financial management component. Right? You can tell how well a project is performing against its schedule, even looking at things like scope by measuring CRs or estimate to complete against baselines. But it's very difficult to tell truly what is the actual health of a project without that financial management component. So in my opinion, it's got to be there. It's got to be one of those things that you introduce sooner rather than later so that you can make realistic decisions on whether to continue with projects or whether to escalate major issues. If folks are using financials right now and they're not using it in a tool like Clarity, chances are they're in a spreadsheet or they're in some other tool. Either way, it's disconnected from the actual execution of the project itself. The project manager may be filling out the spreadsheet manually, inputting data that they're receiving as inputs from an invoicing system and updates from team members, and then maybe perhaps even pulling data out of Clarity to populate these spreadsheets. Obviously, there's the duplicative entry there where you're taking data from one system and using it to fill out a form or an Excel spreadsheet. But more importantly, it's disconnected, like I say, from the project itself. So by associating the financials with the project in the same tool, it lends some confidence in the information that you're presenting. If your forecast is in the same object that your project plan is, as it would be in Clarity, then the financial managers and the analysts and the portfolio managers that are making decisions on that data have a lot more confidence in it. They know you're not just typing into a field. It's actually associated with your project. And as you'll see, one of the true value props is actually tie it to your project schedule. It's a bit more of a mature concept, but we'll get to it. And the third bullet here talks about really being able to use financial forecasts for strategic planning. If you think about the modules of roadmaps and portfolios within the tool even, both of those lean on financials very heavily. So the planned capital cost, the budgeted capital cost, operating costs, all of those are key constraints and key metrics that are used at that portfolio level or the roadmap level, and both really contribute to overall strategic decisions. So whether you're doing annual planning or if you're doing quarterly reviews, the ability to introduce financials into that process is invaluable, right? So your portfolio managers will thank you, I guarantee it, because if they don't have financials today in their portfolio module, they're asking for it, right? And then they may be sourcing that from some other application or from those spreadsheets that I mentioned earlier. So it gets you into that game, allows you to do really robust strategic planning. And lastly, but certainly not least, the ability for you to report out using financial metrics just carries a certain weight, right, a gravitas. So when you're talking about the progress of your project, if you say my project's going to be 1,000 hours over budget, or you say my project's going to be $250,000 over budget, the $250,000 tends to resonate more because that's the language that, by and large, our executives speak in. They don't necessarily understand that or care, I should say, about the number of hours that a project is demanding or is committed to. But they do care about the amount of money that we've committed to that project and whether you're going to be over or under that. So it's a language that resonates at all different levels of the organization. So being able to introduce this really allows you to communicate a little bit more effectively with upper leadership, and escalations you'll find are much more smooth when it comes to escalating financial concerns than they are, let's say, schedule or effort. Sarah, in your experience, any other key value drivers here to help us answer the question why, and have any of these particularly been important for your clients?
I think you hit all the right points. I think the one thing I'd add is, most of the time project managers are managing their financials anyway, right? You're doing it in some other tool, a spreadsheet, some other financial system. And so it's not like functionality that's brand new or, processes that are brand new to these project managers. We're really just making it, bringing it all together in one place. And like Wes said, giving that value, giving that weight to our reporting, because now we can report on everything about our project in one spot. So I think, just having the ability to get that all in one place is really what we're kind of trying to drive to here.
Yep. Yeah, agreed. And that, I think, generally will help us, if you have a good understanding of the why and everybody agrees on that, then the what and the how, get really easy to introduce or really easy to accomplish. Focus on that why initially. Again, it goes for really any implementation or any modular deployment, but particularly for financials. Everybody agrees on why we're doing it. Then any incremental work that may be introduced as a result of it is appreciated because of the end value that it gives you. That cost-benefit analysis is as important in introducing financials as it is in anything else. So having answered or at least asked the questions why and developed some company-specific answers, you get into the what, right? What do we actually have to do to introduce financials, specifically in Clarity, right? And we're going to talk about some of the really tactical steps that you need to accomplish in order to present financial metrics at a project level. And what we're going to cover over the next handful of slides is they're kind of foundational things. our recommendation generally when we're talking about the introduction of financials is to build out the infrastructure to prepare yourself for the full kind of breadth of what you can do within the system. That doesn't mean that you have to use all of the bells and whistles that go along with it. So just like anything else, the deployment of financials is a crawl, walk, run type of proposition. And when we get into the demonstration, you're actually going to see that. So the theme here is that the next couple of slides just talk about what we should get set up as table stakes, right? What do we need to have in place? And then as a company, we decide, well, now that we can do all of this, what pieces do we want to roll out first, second, and third? What's the order? What's the progression? What can my users consume versus what I can actually roll out as a capability? So while we're going to cover all these underlying pieces, keep in the back of your mind the fact that this is absolutely a phase-based rollout where you take baby steps as you go through the introduction of this capability in your company. These are the major components, however, we're going to talk about. There's a core set of financial pieces and setup that's required. We're going to talk about that first. And then in no particular order, there's roughly about 6 other elements that you need to consider as you're establishing the financial management module in your system. There's a rate matrix. There's the introduction of actual costs, both from labor and non-labor. There's the definition and use of cost plans. They have financial attributes that are used in grouping those cost plans and classifying your actuals. And then there's some integration conversations that should be had as a part of any good financial management rollout. So we talk about that first piece, the core financial components. It begins and really ends with what's called the entity in Clarity. The entity itself is the core financial object. You establish an entity for each of your implementations, and then a number of pieces hang off of that entity. The entity itself really drives a number of things, 2 of which are, I think, important here. One is the home and the reporting currency. So a system can have as many entities as you would like. Each entity, however, can only have one home currency. So when we see implementations with multiple entities, it's usually driven by a multi-currency requirement, although that's not necessarily the one and only driver in defining multiple entities. Generally speaking, our goal is to try to keep you to one entity, and there are some solutions around multi-currency that would allow you to do that even if you have those requirements. The more entities you have, the more administration you have, so on and so forth. It's similar to the conversation around partitioning, where it adds some value. You want to try to reduce administration as much as you can, keep the system as simple as you can. But you do have to establish at least that one base entity. From there, you're aligning that entity with a financial OBS, and that comes along the lines of a department and a location. So 2 actually distinct OBSs. They're driven by an actual object and an OBS that's built on that object. So I'd go in and I'd create all my departments or my cost centers. I'd create locations that are tied to those departments, and that inherently links them up through to my entity. So when I create a project, I can link that project to a department, which links it to a location, which links it to an entity, which drives its own currency. So this is what has been previously called in Clarity the financial organizational structure, and it's under the administration section of the tool in the financial management section. Within that entity, you also define fiscal periods. So if you're running a monthly fiscal period, or if you have a specific start and finish date for your monthly period, or if you're running 13 periods out of the year, all that can be defined within the entity. So it doesn't have to be your calendar month, right? You define those fiscal periods there within that entity. And then you've got all of the currencies that you may need to define as related to not only the entity, but just the deployment as a whole. I mentioned the home and reporting currency is driven by the entity. You also have some flexibility around the billing currency that can be established. And then there's also what we call natural currency, and there's a euro. So every transaction that gets created in the system can get created in any one of 5 different currencies. So you have a lot of flexibility there. We'll talk a little bit more about currencies when we get into actuals and the input of actuals. But know that just because you have the need to present multi-currency doesn't mean that you need multiple entities to do so. The WIP is extremely flexible. WIP is our work in progress table. And again, I'll get into that when we talk about actuals. And of course, if you're introducing currencies, you probably need to introduce some exchange rates. So all basic core setup pieces.
Yeah, Wes, I just want to chime in here. For those of us whose heads are exploding as Wes talks about the things that he just talked about, I think it's really important to point out that, the things that he just talked about on that previous slide are typically things that like the finance team would get involved in helping make those decisions. It's, something that we want to make sure we plan out really well. And like Wes said, keep as simple as possible, not get too complex with too many entities and all those different things. But really, it's a well thought out one-time setup, and then everything will just sort of flow from there. And so if it seemed like that was a lot, and we can't even really begin to decide where we would start thinking through that. I think just know that's where we provide help. That's where a company that's done this before can give you some guidance. That's where maybe another company who's implemented financial management can tell you some best practices. But really, that's something that you want to think through well and get set up, in the right method so that everything else that Wes is about to talk about will flow naturally from there.
Yeah, well said, Sarah. It certainly, even just the terminology here can get a little overwhelming. When you actually see it in the system, it's not nearly as complicated as I think it comes across perhaps in these slides. We're always here to help. And I think she makes a great point that keeping it simple is the key here. It doesn't have to be overly complex to get value out of it. So speaking of complex, so in the next piece we'll talk about our financial attributes. So the diagram here looks a little busy, but again, I'll simplify it here. The goal of the financial elements, of the classification pieces, is truly just to classify your costs, right? Folks, if you start at a very high level, folks will look at project costs, and they may break those down into just capital and operating, right? That in and of itself is a financial classification. So at its simplest level, you have a field called cost type that allows you to differentiate capital costs or cap-eligible costs against operating costs. So as something as simple as that is a base financial classification. What we then see is folks tend to introduce additional classifications to add some additional granularity. And this diagram basically outlines all of the options that you have. The elements that we see get used most often are your transaction classes. That breaks your costs down into labor and non-labor, and that non-labor may be further decomposed into hardware and software and fixed fee services. But that's your transaction class. People may then take it down to the next level, which is your resource class. The resource class, again, adds an additional level of granularity. So for external labor, maybe you have an onshore and offshore resource class. And all that can help you can further define, categorize, and report upon specific levels of detail in your financial structure. So again, with the idea here of keeping it simple from the start, you may just look at cost type and say, we're just using capital and operating. That's as simple as we're going to go. And then further down the road, you break your costs into transaction classes and then further into resource classes. We have folks that get uber complex with it. If they have specific projects that are using certain rate cards and others, then we introduce things like an investment class. So there's a lot of flexibility here in how you leverage these financial classifications. But the box here on the left where it says by object is the way that I visualize this. It shows you all of the different classification options that you have really by object, project, resource, transaction, timesheet, things like that. The next slide shows you some of the basic use cases for these. So again, taking that list and giving you kind of our best practices, the two pieces here that I see used most often, again, the transaction class, which is the second from the bottom. This gives you, again, your hardware, software, labor, those types of designations. Your resource class, which gives you perhaps a salary grade or some other lower level of decomposition. And your cost type, which is right in the middle there, capital and operating. All those other pieces, again, in most cases, they're either rarely used or have a very specific purpose as defined by your specific company requirements. So I think at a minimum, if you're just starting with financials, think cost type, think transaction class and resource class. As financial requirements dictate it, then you can introduce things like your investment class, WIP class, decomposing rates and grouping financial plans by department. But all those can get added on as you go along. So speaking of rates, a lot of those you saw that we had in that table drive specific rate requirements. So you do want to establish a rate matrix. And again, the rate matrix can be uber simple, right? We have some folks that start out with a single blended rate for all of the resources in their system, right? And that means certainly that it's not going to tie one for one with the financial system of record, and that's okay. Right, so starting simply with your rate matrix can get folks into the mindset of tracking financials at a project level. But of course, you have the flexibility to take it down to a very granular level of detail. On one end of the spectrum, we've got that simple blended rate. On the other end of the spectrum, we have folks that are creating multiple rate matrices to represent different locations. They have rate matrix that represent different rate cards. So again, the system is designed to handle kind of the utmost complexity, but we would recommend you scale that accordingly to your maturity. The matrix itself is worth just a few comments just in terms of how it's set up. You basically define those financial classifications that are going to drive the rate. So let's say you have a transaction class established for internal resources and external resources. By introducing that transaction class as a column in your rate matrix, you can then define a different rate for onshore resources and offshore resources. So again, it's kind of aligned with your financial classification granularity. The more detail you have there, the more detail you can have in your rate matrix. One of the pieces that we tend to get asked about pretty often is how you represent contractors in your rate matrix against employees. The rule of thumb, by and large, is that employees will have a blended rate, sometimes decomposed by salary grade, or let's call it a resource class, whereas contractors typically have exact rates in there. That allows us to reconcile with invoicing, allows us perhaps to even do some reverse invoicing if necessary. So again, really up to you and your financial requirements and what you're allowed to track in your financial system. But know that you can get very specific with it, but that also comes at a cost of being able and being required to manage that matrix. Sarah, any other kind of best practices on the rate matrix itself? Seen any good practices?
Yeah, no, I think, I've seen everything across the board when it comes to the rate matrix. So I think, thinking it through and finding the best way to represent that for you would be one of those key, steps right up front. I've seen, like Wes said, companies where we've got just one blended rate across all resources, and we're really just trying to get more of a sense of a time and cost perspective out of CA PPM. It was a certain number of hours, which equates to roughly a certain amount of dollars, and that's the level of financials we're looking for. I've seen the total flip side where we had individual contractors named in the rate matrix with their actual exact, $37.42 rate in there, because we wanted to get a really true representation out of the system. And so I think, it's important to know that either end of that spectrum is fine as long as we understand, like Wes said, the implications of that. When we have those actual rates in there, we really have to think about, we're exposing those rates. Somebody books 1 hour on a timesheet, and then we can see that 1 hour equated to that $37.42 because that's an actual cost that will hit our project. So it's really important to find that balance between the level of detail that we want to capture and what we're then exposing to our end users. But just to know that either one of those is fine. We just need to understand the implications of what it is we want to report on.
Yep. Well said. Well said. We've seen the gamut, right? And we can give you some recommendations on that. Obviously, introducing those rates allow you to report upon actual costs, like Sarah said. And the mechanism by which you report out on those or actually present them in the project are called financial plans in Clarity. So that's the tab that everybody sees when you first log into a project. It's kind of buried in the middle of the tab set at the top. The financial plan designation is kind of an umbrella term. So the way I explain it is that a financial plan can be a forecast, it can be a benefit plan, it can be a budget. It can be any one of those. A financial plan is that umbrella term. The cost plan is the object in which any one of those financial plans is captured. So think of the cost plan as the vessel, right? That's the object in which you collect all of this data. And then you, using flags and other fields, designate that cost plan as either a forecast or a budget plan, or you represent that as a benefit plan. So think of it in that terms. Financial plan is your umbrella. The cost plan is the object in which you're collecting this, and then you, using flags, represent that cost plan as either a forecast or a budget, and tie both of those to a benefit plan as needed. Some other terms that you'll hear thrown around, the POR, that's a plan of record. So when you're creating your very first cost plan, it becomes your POR cost plan, and that's how we refer to it, or when we refer to it, as a forecast in Clarity. So planned cost, typically used interchangeably with forecast, is your POR cost plan in Clarity. So you'll hear that a lot. It's simply a flag that's checked on a cost plan. Say, this is my POR cost plan. What it allows us to do is create as many cost plans as we want. Only one at any given time is represented as your forecast, your POR cost plan. That POR cost plan can be submitted for approval as an official budget plan. So that budget plan then becomes locked. You can't go in and edit it, not even an administrator. To make revisions to the budget plan, you actually have to submit a revision. That revision is also approved and sits as Rev 1 versus 0 in your project. So there's some versioning control that happens just inherently by you creating various forecasts and, as needed, submitting them as budgets and budget revisions. So that's the terminology, and at least the way that I explain it. Some kind of more tactical elements to this as we talk through, the values of each one of these. The cost plan itself can be created manually. You can go in and create, just type the numbers in directly. At least it gets you out of Excel. You're not necessarily taking advantage of all of the processing that can happen behind the scenes, but you're now in the Clarity system. You're entering costs against your project, right? That's a win. If you take that a step further, you can actually create those cost plans from your investment team using allocations, or from task assignments using your schedule. That's really where the value starts to become very relevant or obvious, where you're tying your costs to your project schedule. You use all types of any of those financial classifications that we've talked about as grouping attributes, and it's also a great way to see actuals as they hit your project plan. You'll see them decrement your planned costs in the future.
Hey, Wes, a question that came up that I think it might behoove us to just kind of talk about with the group is just kind of generally, how have we seen success with this financial setup? Do we think people are more successful if they set up all their project stuff, allocation tasks, all that, and then get to financials? Or from the flip side, would we recommend that, people start with, some level of financials and then, build out the project stuff from there? Just interested in your take on that, and just kind of the why of when we might want to do one or the other, and if we've started with one, when it makes sense to kind of start building into the other.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, of course it varies. What I typically see, though, is that one of the major value propositions of Clarity as a product is to be able to see all of your investments in a portfolio. Like, that's what we talk about really day one, right? What is the portfolio view of your investments to allow you to make some real strategic decisions around that? To get into the portfolio game, or at least to see that view of a project inventory, typically requires that at a minimum kind of the base set of financials. And what we call a simple budget with simple budgeting, where basically you're just entering in a number, capital and operating. So you're not getting into actually creating financial plans just yet. You're just adding the financial details to the project, essentially on that Properties tab. That's usually what I see as kind of step one, and then folks will grow into the creation of cost plans. So the cost plan concept itself can be a little bit complex, right? Because now you're introducing those financial classifications. You got to understand what a transaction class is and a resource class, things like that, which are more mature concepts. So in my opinion, what I've seen is be most successful is if you start with that very simple budget, just two numbers, capital and operating. That way at a portfolio level, you're now getting that roll-up that you can see and make decisions on, but you're not asking your project managers to get in and know all the nuances of the creation of a cost plan. Similar to what you've seen, or have you seen it differently?
Yep, nope, absolutely. Yep, I think you hit it all.
And I usually see that even when we get to cost plans, I see folks taking baby steps in there. So maybe they just establish a cost plan manually first, and then they take that further and start using allocations or team assignments. So even once you get into plans, there's still a maturity progression that happens. And what I see the most successful implementations tie that to an existing financial management process or a planning process. So outside of the tool, folks typically would have established a progression of estimates that start with maybe a ROM estimate. And that may just be a single capital or operating number. Then they break that down into what we call an HLE or a high-level estimate, where you maybe introduce a cost plan to break this down by labor and non-labor. And then you get to a definitive estimate after having done your requirements and analysis work, where you're now breaking that down into detailed transaction classes and resource classes. You're finally at a point where you've got as low a level of detail as you possibly need. So yeah, there's definitely a progression here, and that should be planned out well in advance of your financials deployment. A quick note on benefit plans. It's a piece that's, I'll say, gaining in popularity recently. A lot of my clients now are dipping their toe into the benefit and value management elements of this. The benefit plan itself in Clarity is extremely straightforward. It really allows you to classify benefits in alignment with your company's value categories. So it has a benefit class, a benefit subclass, totally free-form drop-downs. You're allowed to put in kind of whatever alignment criteria meets your company's value statements, and then tie those to your forecast and to your budget plan, so that it automatically generates things like your ROI and MPV and things like that. So even if you're tying just a very high-level benefit to the project, it's helpful. At least it's a ballpark number. The challenge typically with benefits as folks bump into, or folks start to introduce value management and benefit management, is that the benefit piece out of the box in the system looks at monetized benefits. So you need to quantify or monetize the benefits you're going to get out of a project in order to tie it to a financially driven forecast or a budget. So what we tend to see are folks perhaps start a little bit simply when they do benefit and value management, where they maybe look at metrics first that aren't quantifiable, and then they introduce more monetized benefits, having looked at a process by which they add a dollar amount to those realized metrics. So again, progression there as well, but I do see more and more folks taking advantage of the benefit module that exists there in the benefit plan. So that having established your rate matrix, your cost plans are established, let's start seeing actual costs get presented in there. And again, actual costs can come from a number of different places. The two that we see most often is from a financial system of record for non-labor, and in the case of actual costs for labor, from our timesheets. And the timesheets themselves require a bit of setup. Right? So slightly aside from this, but you'll want to establish a timesheet submission cadence and how often you're posting those. So as a project manager, I want my project actuals to be accurate as of every Monday, so we have folks submit on a Friday. We post all of that over the weekend, and they're able to review and make adjustments to it early in the following week. So you want to establish a cadence like that, and that should follow your timesheet submission process as well as any financial posting processes that you have. Approvals are always important, not only because now you're approving time, but you're also approving the financials that are tied to those. And you have to take into account timesheet adjustments. So if you have a financial close or window in which you can't make adjustments, you have to handle that with retroactive time period open and closings, and perhaps notifications out to your finance team to say, hey, my team forgot to submit their timesheet for the last month. We're going to introduce a decent amount of financial actuals here if we have them all submitted at once. How do we handle that? At least it prompts the conversation. There's a number of systematic ways you can handle that, but really the goal here is to make sure that you're communicating with finance to handle those types of things. There are some considerations when it comes to financials as they're driven by timesheets. By and large, it's around kind of country-specific requirements. So we've had some work councils that will require a hard cap on timesheets or allow you to further classify overtime by certain rate specifications. So there's a lot of investigation, I should say, that you should do around that to make sure that your timesheet policy is in compliance with any other work councils and things of that nature. But that's really where your labor actuals typically come from, those timesheets. They're hitting the rate matrix, and they're getting classified based on the resources financial classifications, and they're being presented now in your cost plans.
Non-labor. One thing I'll add there with, I'm sorry, Wes, just to go back to that for a second. I tend to work with a lot of companies that maybe aren't ready for timesheets or are doing time in some other system, and I think it's important to point out that that is totally fine too. We have ways that we can either interface those hours in or have some other way of capturing those costs. And so I think that, I've heard sometimes with companies that I work with that maybe aren't ready for time that, does that mean I can't even use financials? And I think the answer there is no. It's still worth investigating. It's still worth looking into how, the different ways that we can get those labor costs into the tool and, even our non-labor costs as well. And so I wouldn't see whether or not you're using timesheets as a barrier to even going down this financial path.
Yeah, absolutely. A great point. When we talk about non-labor here, you could essentially, if you're not doing timesheets in Clarity, extrapolate the comments we have on non-labor to your labor conversation as well. So non-labor typically is imported from some other external system. And you can do the exact same thing with a time entry system that's outside of the tool, right? So you bring in both non-labor and labor. Great point. The traditional scenario is that you're importing these non-labor transactions, however. So your hardware, your software, these aren't things obviously that are being tied to a timesheet or anything like that. And within Clarity, you have a couple of ways to get it into the system. Ultimately, they all make their way into what we call a transaction entry. So on that side, on the application side, you can actually create a transaction manually. We usually see folks with an Excel file that gets zogged into the transaction object. But either way, it makes its way into this quote-unquote transaction object. Once that transaction is created, it merges with any transactions that are created as a part of timesheets. So they essentially make their way into the same posting process. The input mechanisms are just different. Timesheets would generate labor transactions. Your import from a financial system or your manually entered non-labor transactions would come from that manual process. We'll talk about integrations in a bit, but this is one of the areas where we see this happen, most often. But ultimately, those two, again, like I say, merge into the same posting process. There's a series of jobs that get run behind the scenes. And the jobs even themselves, while they sound complicated, you're really just running 4 jobs, right? You run your posted timesheets typically, post transactions to financials, you post the WIP, and you run this import financial actuals. So while the terms themselves may sound a little complicated, it's really just you running 4 jobs in succession. And now you have converted any timesheets or imported transactions into actual financial records in the system. You run a validation against them to make sure that all of the data elements and classifications tied to them are accurate. You posted them to your work in progress table, which is where we do all of our reporting, and you then push that out to the projects. So by you running these 4 jobs, you've really completed that end-to-end financial process. So a lot of words there, but the process itself actually is not too bad. And I think for folks who have been using financials, I think if you ask them, they'll say, that the actual posting process here, and even the terminology, once you get familiar with it, is not as complicated perhaps as it seems at first glance. So on to the last question,
and I'm sorry, I missed you saying it, so that's why I want to call it out, but someone's asking, What do you mean by the application side? I'm not sure what you were talking about. I'm sorry, because I was answering questions. But
sorry. Yeah. So meaning that it doesn't have to be an admin function. So when I say on the application side, meaning that it's on, it's a actual link on the home menu of your Clarity implementation. So there's actually a transaction entry link, and I can actually show you when we get into the system, that you can designate somebody to have access to. So it doesn't have to be a behind-the-scenes admin function. All right? Typically we'll see is a system admin or a functional admin or even a financial analyst will have access to this transaction entry link, and that'll allow them to go in and create these transactions. And whether they do it manually or if we have a little script that pulls it in from an Excel file, really kind of end result. But application side, meaning that it's done, it can be done by a base user. It doesn't need to be an administrative function. Yeah, good clarification.
Cool, thanks.
So we talk about integrations. I've referenced a couple of these already. Some we see more often than others. I'll highlight a few of the more common ones here. But when you're talking about financials, you don't have to have any integrations, right? I should say that to start. But there's some obvious places where there's some real efficiencies you can introduce and eliminate any data inaccuracies by having manual intervention, which are two key value propositions for any integration. So some things that you should consider at least, and weigh the pros and cons of any type of development work versus the manual work that you would have to do if the integration isn't in place. I talked about the labor and non-labor inbound. That's one that we see most often, right? Any one of my financial-oriented clients has some type of inbound interface from a financial system, by and large. And that may be fully automated. The systems may be talking directly. It may be partially automated, meaning that they get an extract from the financial system and then they upload it to Clarity, right? Or it may be completely manual, where they get an extract and they're typing those transactions in. But either way, the two systems are talking. It just depends on the level of automation that you proceed with. But that's one that we almost always look at introducing as early as possible. Some of the other ones that we've seen that are popular are the outbound side. Capitalization data, or really timesheet data generally. So as employees are working on projects, they're working on cap-eligible activities. Well, we can send that data back to finance for actual capitalization, right? With contractors, right, we can capture their specific hours on a project and use that during invoice validation. Or as some of my clients do reverse invoicing. So we actually generate the invoice out of Clarity and say, hey, here's what we're paying you. Your contractors have entered time into our system. Expect a check in the next 30 to 60 days. So a lot of things that you can do with time entry as it goes on the outbound side and the financial monetization of that heading out to a financial system or an invoicing system. So I know I covered a lot in terms of the what. What are these pieces that you have to do, from the rate matrix, labor, non-labor costs, your cost plans, all the different classifications you have, even the entity itself and all the multi-currency variations that you can possibly have. But at the base level, that's it. Right? I know that's probably the overstatement of the year, but it's really not much more than that. And if you look at each one of these boxes that we've talked about, you can go very simple on that. Right? You can have a very simple rate matrix. You can use just base timesheets for labor costs. You don't need to import non-labor transactions day one. Right? You can have a simple budget to start, which is just two numbers, and then progress into a transaction class or resource class cost plan. And even progress that further and say, hey, we're going to do benefit plans. But you can start very simply. And your financial attributes can start as just labor and non-labor. Right? So you have an ability to start very simply and evolve this. I think the takeaway for the what, in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here, is that you at least need to account for all of these pieces, right? And as an organization, decide how complex you need to be today versus the future, with an eye towards really where you want to be, when you grow up, right? The easiest way to say it. So we talked about the why, we talked about the what. Let's talk just a little bit about the how, and then I'm going to hop right into a quick demonstration. Before we get to the how, which are some of our best practices, I'd love to get your take on it, right? Having talked through all of this setup and even the value proposition for introducing financials, what do you, as attendees here, having heard kind of the overview so far, perceive to be the biggest obstacles to a successful implementation? Right? Is it a lack of financial management expertise in your PM community? Are your PMs not expected to do financial management yet? Are there complicated requirements from finance that you think have to be met in order to introduce financials? Are there security or compliance concerns with capturing that data in the system? And if there's others, send them our way, right? If there's specific things, we'll try to tackle those in turn. Camille, did you come up with a ditty yet so that we can start getting royalties off of that?
How about you light up my life?
I like it. That's it. Put a trademark on it. Okay, so it looks like a resounding couple of options here. Complicated finance requirements. That's what I see too, right? If I were to click one of those buttons, that's the one that I would check. Because you do need to involve finance in this, right? They need to be a stakeholder in providing the requirements. What I would say to caution there is that while they need to be key stakeholders, they shouldn't drive the solution, right? It's intended to be a project management solution, and you should think of it in terms of project accounting, not full financial GL-based reconciliations. So keep that in mind as you're engaging finance. It's okay to push back on them and say, hey, look, I get that you want this to reconcile like for like with your GL, but either we're not there yet or that's not our requirement, right? And we'll handle that through some other mechanism, perhaps as an integration or with some back-end financial processing. But as a PM, my focus is on the finances of my project and whether they're directionally correct and truly indicative of my project health, right? So it's okay to push back a little bit on finance there. I say that, and it's certainly a lot easier to say than to actually do. Now, some other things to think about in terms of best practices: keep things as simple as possible. Hopefully, you've heard that said again and again as we went through our slides today. Spend time on that full architecture, right? Think about where you want to be, like I say, when you grow up. But you do need to at least address in small part all of those key components that we talked about. Think of it as project accounting, right? It doesn't have to match your financial system of record penny for penny, right? It's designed to present a true picture of project health. So if you're budgeting using blended rates, then forecast using blended rates, right? That's really the key. Make sure you're just comparing apples to apples. If you have some outputs that finance has and you want to and you need to replicate those, start with those outputs and then work backwards. There's a great way for you to define true requirements, and then you can kind of mold your configurations according to that. Like I say, do involve that finance team, but don't be scared to push back on them, understanding the core capabilities of the product and really what the intent of financial management and Clarity is geared towards. And, of course, think about integrations, but be practical about it. Integrations aren't a huge proposition these days. They're not something that requires a lot of money and a lot of investment, but there still should be a true reason for doing it, right? Be strategic in how you define these things. So with that said, I've left myself just a few minutes here, and I do want to hop into our system and just kind of walk through some of these concepts in really just about 5 minutes or so. But I think it'll be helpful to see kind of what we've been talking about here so far. So I'm going to share my screen. You should see CA PPM coming up. We had some issues with browser-specific visibility of the screen sharing piece. If you don't see it, keep in mind this is going to be recorded. You'll be able to come back and look at the screen share here at a later point. But I thought it was valuable. I thought it was worth the risk to us to actually try sharing a screen here because I want you to see this stuff live and in person. I think it'll maybe set some minds at ease. You should be seeing CA PPM. And worth mentioning right from the gate, you actually get a little preview here of a new feature that's getting released in one of the future versions of Clarity. this is what we call the Phoenix UI, right? And it's intended to take the classic and make it look a little bit more like the modern, right? So for folks who have been having challenges getting into the modern UX, the Phoenix UI is going to be a nice enablement of that. So if you do have to flip between the two experiences, that transition is going to be a little bit more smooth. So you're going to totally different look and feel than what you're used to in the classic, something that's yet to come. We wanted to kind of highlight some of the new features here. So I want to show you just quickly that some of those elements that we talked about. I'm into the admin side here. I've established my corporate entity here. So here's some of those terms we've talked about. It has a location. It has a department. It's got a series of fiscal time periods. I've created my fiscal time periods all the way out through 2022. Within the financial structure, I've got a series of classifications here. So there's my transaction classes, and here I've just got some basic hardware, software, internal labor, external labor. I've then decomposed those transaction classes into resource classes. So my external labor, I've got onshore and offshore. That'll allow me in my rate matrix to define specific rates for folks that are onshore and offshore. So speaking of rate matrix, I have established that rate matrix here. I just has a single one here, and in this case, I'm grouping it by resource role, location, and transaction class. Again, the more columns here I have, the more detail I can introduce in terms of rate granularity. You'll see in here that I've got some line items for non-labor. So I've got a $1 rate for software, hardware, travel, things like that. That allows me to enter these non-labor transactions very efficiently. And I've even created some resources in here that represent those non-labor. So in this case, I have just an example, a hardware resource. So all of those screens that I just showed you in a matter of seconds here it basically encapsulates the first 5, 6, 7, 8 slides that we walk through. It's really not as complex as perhaps it comes across on paper. But with that said, the piece I really wanted to show you is that progression that Sarah and I have been talking about, where we go through the deployment of financials as a crawl, walk, run, or various phases here. At the very start, if you're just introducing financials, you can introduce what we call simple budgeting. So I've come into a phase 1 here, and this is an out-of-the-box subpage where all I'm doing is entering in a single number here under planned capital cost. So I just type in the value here that I'm expecting for planned capital. I can do the same with planned operating. I then have the ability here even to say, hey, I want to set my budget equal to my plan. So I can, at a very simplest level, just enter 2 numbers, planned capital, planned operating, and that comes up with my total planned cost. If I decide that, yep, that's what's been approved, I check this little box and it sets my budgeted numbers equal to that. So literally day 1, all you're entering is those 2 pieces of information. So a very simple budget. I haven't gotten to financial plans at all, but that gets you into the top-level portfolio management analysis of the work. If I then take that to the next level, phase 2, I start introducing cost plans. So I come over to financial plans, and I begin creating these manually. So I come here, I click New Manual Plan, and I'm just typing in my values here manually. So again, I'm out of the Excel world at least, but there is some effort there in having a project manager come in and put these numbers in. But again, there's some value in just doing that. So as a step 2 or phase 2, you're introducing cost plans now by, in this case, cost type and transaction class, but I'm entering these cost plans manually. Again, it's not a huge change management effort, but allows the financial analyst to get now more detail. So you have a contour to your cost. You could see how over a period of time there was some capital and some operating costs as well. And then lastly, to take this all the way to the end of the spectrum for folks that are looking to be as mature as possible with financial management, we actually begin generating these cost plans using tasks assignments or investment teams. So the task assignment actually goes in to your project schedule. So under actions here, I'm just clicking populate from task assignments. It goes right to my project schedule, and based on the tasks that these resources are assigned to, it contours and organizes all of my, not only my actual costs, but my planned costs according to, in this case, capital and the transaction class that they're tied to. So literally with one click now, I've got a forecast, which could ultimately represent my approved budget, that's tied directly to my project schedule. It reflects the reality of my project. So that's the kind of ultimate maturity that you want to perhaps get to, but it doesn't have to be there day one, right? That the idea here is that you can crawl, you can walk, and you can run into financials. So with that said, I know I bumped us up right against 1 o'clock. Sarah, Camille, any questions in there that we think we can squeeze in under the wire?
Yeah, so we've had some questions about kind of some more advanced reporting type things around financials. For those of you who have asked those, I've taken those down, and I'm going to have Wes reach out to you specifically to talk about those things, just so we can get an answer to those questions. So if we weren't able to answer, your more complex questions, know that we'll get to it. And then we've also had a couple questions about the Phoenix UI. It's something that IT Design developed and was selling to clients for a while, and then CA purchased from them. And so as far as we know, it's just a skin. It's just a UI theme that will be available coming in March. We're not sure yet if it will be for 15.6 and forward, or if, kind of anyone will be able to enable it, maybe 15.5 and forward starting in March. So we're still trying to figure that out, but March is the rough time frame for when that skin, that UI theme, will be able to be available to people.
Great. So with that, Camille, we'll hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Wes, Sarah, thanks so much for your time. So as we conclude, we just want to invite you to join us live and in person at RegoUniversity. We're going to be in San Diego in September. It's at Paradise Point Resort and Spa, and it's beautiful. You get bungalow-style guest rooms. There's bonfires on the beach. You can get a pontoon boat. And then, of course, there's all of the wonderful training, and you get access to our Rego guides. So this conference started because we were looking, or our clients were looking for a place where they could engage in debate and knowledge sharing and learn best practices without getting sold stuff. And so this is really a fun event, and we encourage you to come. It's only $800 right now because of early bird. And that's the only other thing I wanted to mention. So thank you for being with us. On behalf of Rego Consulting, we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.